Wow, pretty tough following someone like Mark Lepar. What an amazing scientific communicator he is. I'll do my best for you guys. So hello, I'm Jessie. I'm from the Conservation Ecology Centre. Recently I completed my honours research with Federation University, and I was looking at the habitat suitability for the Eastern Ground Parrot and how this has changed over time. For my time slot here today, I want to share with you a general overview of the species, the Otways story of the ground parrot, and further, what has led us to the likely localised extinction, and where do we currently stand in terms of knowledge and landscape condition. So, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that Eastern Mar recognised the treeless heaths of the Otways, which is a focal vegetation type of this study, in the Eastern Mar Country Plan for the roles that these systems play for threatened species, including the Eastern Ground Parrot. This work was undertaken on Guttabanud country, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners. So, a little bit about the bird. These birds forage at ground level in thick vegetation and only occasionally take voluntary flight, although they are very capable flyers, with birds being observed over 150 kilometres away from known populations, and this is often natally dispersed juveniles. They eat a wide variety of food species, but are really heavily reliant on dense and abundant food sources, particularly to get them through the breeding period. So, small seeds, they need a lot of these to meet their energy requirements, and it takes a long time for them to forage them, and this demand is increased while the chicks are in the nest. So they also require this dense ground vegetation for roosting, nesting, and it can provide them some resilience against predators as well. So historically, the Eastern Ground Parrots were distributed patchily along the coastline. Now, we have a couple of remnant isolated populations persisting in Discovery Bay and in Wilson's Prom, with the stronghold of the species being in East Gippsland area. So globally, the Eastern Ground Parrot, it's considered least concern, and this is because it's often lumped in with the Tasmanian Eastern Ground Parrot and not recognised as a subspecies. They've got really great numbers in Tasmania, and our mainland species aren't doing so great across the range. In 2019-2020, bushfires impacted large areas of the ground parrot habitat over to the east, and this triggered the Victorian conservation status to be changed to endangered. This highlights the importance of having Eastern Ground Parrot populations distributed in disjunct populations widely across the range for the conservation of the species, so not having all your eggs in one nest, so to speak. So my study, I primarily focused on the northwestern heathlands in Carlisle and Chapel Vale, with a secondary focus in the Blanket Bay and Anglesey areas. So in brackets, it shows the last known observations of ground parrots relative to the area. No records in Carlisle, although it's really likely that this area previously did occupy ground parrots due to having suitable habitat through that area, or potentially suitable habitat. Chapel Vale and Devondale in 1991. So this was surveyed by Dr. Charles Meredith, who did some big reports across the state in the 90s and the 80s on Eastern Ground Parrots. He also surveyed down in Blanket Bay as well. The last record of ground parrots down there were in the 70s, but a historical report that I found from Charles details of park ranger flushing ground parrots in 1991. But as this wasn't confirmed in formal survey, it wasn't documented through our ALL, Australian Living Atlas. So it was just in that record there. So Anglesey, a random detection on a monitoring camera in 2011. Although it's not typically considered ground parrot habitat, it gives hope that at the time birds were either trying to disperse into the Otways or dispersing out, and there may have still been remnant populations. Fire forest management has been undertaking acoustic monitoring program across the Otways and trying to detect ground parrots. Unfortunately, 2 years of monitoring across the Otways has failed to detect any. So why these places? Why only these spots? So the wet heath. Ground parrots, they will use a variety of vegetation types across their range, and they do have a wide range of food species, but it's this wet heath, the treeless stuff that you see in the top image, and when it is at its most suitable vegetative state, that's a critical resource for ground parrots. So meaning when the vegetation is at low level, it's complex, it's dominated by key food species such as buttongrass, xanthorrhea, and diverse shrub species such as Pezoporus. So it's dense food source, it's shelter, and it can provide some resilience against predators for a ground nesting species. So we had ground parrots in the Otways, and what's happened? So many contributing factors. There's evidence of all of these factors occurring and likely did contribute to the localised extinction of the Eastern Ground Parrot in the Otways. The most widely accepted contribution is the change in the suitability of habitat. So in this available time spot, I'm going to cover more deeply into the change of fire regimes over time and how that correlates with suitable ground parrot habitat. So this is all the wet heath grouped into age classes that correspond with the documented responses of ground parrots to time since fire in similar heath systems. So it doesn't account for all the variables of fire or vegetation condition, but it is enough to observe broad changes in age classes distributed over time specific to the wet heath. So this is from 1984, and it's a series of timestamps that I did this age class mapping for. It was really cool to put the old observations of ground parrots over that and see what sort of areas that they were occupying, showing that they were using age classes in the range of less than 8 or less than 13 years old, and some of the older stuff as well, which correlates to reports of how ground parrots would typically use these type of systems. So, the graph up the top shows the age class in percentage of wet heath across 4 different years over time. So 1984 and 1991, ground parrots did occupy the northwestern heathlands. It's not to suggest that the ground parrot population was thriving during this time, because evidence suggests that it was not. But in the context of habitat change as a focus and fire trends, we can see that age class is relatively evenly distributed across the heaths, and 40 to 50% of this is in the most suitable age class for ground parrots. And in both occurring years, there's some new heath that's coming in that will become suitable for ground parrots potentially in the future. You can clearly see the distribution of age class shifts coming into the year 2000. So this corresponds with the millennial drought, which likely influenced planned burning at the time. So no recently burnt heath regenerating, and a big spike in ageing heaths older than 23 years since fire. 2023, there's some new stuff coming in as a result of wildfire and winter planned burns in the recent years. The bottom graph that you can see is just some data from my floristic surveys showing average species richness, being average numbers of species for each of the patches of wet heath that I sampled. So it shows decline as time since fire increases. So often the species that are dropping out in these aged patches are our small shrub species. We know key food species flower during spring, but we don't know how reliant ground parrots are on a diversity of food in both wet and dry heaths, particularly as plants move through their phenological stages throughout the year. So this is the potential suitable habitat in the northwest Otways, 3,000 hectares. So clearly defining suitable habitat for a species in a landscape with unique environmental variables such as climate and geology, void of an example population, has its challenges. My study used expert opinion, literature review, spatial analysis, ground checking and floristic and structural surveys to define what suitable habitat was in the Otways. Suitable vegetation doesn't always mean suitable habitat. Patch size and configuration is important as well, with considerations to the known behaviour traits of the bird. I was also able to incorporate advice from Dr. Mark Lepar and include areas that may provide more or less resilience against predators based on what we know of how predators use the Otway landscape. So of this 3,000 hectares of potentially suitable habitat, around 250 hectares is currently in the most suitable condition, with more, maybe likely around 500 hectares coming in after recent burns over the last few years, and some potential sites that need further ground surveys. Really conservative estimates on carrying capacity of the ground parrot in this sort of area. I calculated that the northwest Otways, with around 150 hectares of heath in the most suitable and suitable condition, could support a small population of around 200 ground parrots. So this is really conservative estimate that I'm talking about, but I was really looking at, are we able to support thousands of ground parrots, or are we talking a few hundred? So it's likely in the lower hundreds of the ground parrot population that would be able to support, and this is similar to the population in Wilson's Promontory. So what now? Although it's likely the ground parrot no longer occupies the Otways, some suitable habitat does still occur. There are strong benefits of developing a reintroduction strategy for the ground parrots, although a range of issues would need to be addressed beyond just providing suitable habitat. This is not unobtainable. We have commitment from land managers to work with researchers and traditional owners to restore healthy ground parrot habitat. An intimate knowledge of habitat areas gained during my project can feed into management strategies, feasibility studies and other research that's happening in the area. We continue to build our knowledge on wet heath restoration in patches of long unburnt shrub-dominated wet heath. So that's through Melbourne Uni and through DECA as well. Fire forest management will continue to search for remnant populations of Eastern Ground Parrots or potential recolonisation. And although it's likely that if there were any ground parrots in the Otways, that population would be quite small and isolated, so it may still require intensive management to re-establish a viable population. So these are just some acknowledgements of the main people that were directly involved in my honours research, but I want to acknowledge a community of people who care about the loss of diversity in the Otways and are contributing to and supporting ongoing work in this space. Thank you for listening.
One quick question for Jesse. Thanks, mate. It's really hard to see, you know. Yeah, there's one just up there from Ollie. Where are you, Tim? Yeah, good.
Have you thought about genetics at all? Like if it was quite a small, isolated population, is it possible that it was just too inbred and that might have been a contributing factor?
Yeah, absolutely. I did write up a fair bit on that in my thesis. Didn't really have the time to go into it. I did have it up there on the slide, but in 1983 it was identified that the small remnant population that was there was very likely looking at genetic constraints back then when it was there. Being the Blanket Bay population likely collapsed before, that loss of metapopulation movement, wide-scale burns as well, like it would have put big constraints on the population. With the dispersal potential of the bird, they can be 150 kilometres away from known populations. It's very likely that if there was a population in the Otways, it may have the occasional bird come from either Wilson's Prom or Discovery Bay. So having a population in the middle there could have a lot of benefits in the long run for the species conservation. Yeah.
Thanks, Jessie. And she was terribly nervous beforehand, but you couldn't tell, so well done, mate.